It was a bright, busy morning at one of the city's largest banks. People were lining up at every counter, waiting patiently for their turn. Some were there to deposit money, others to withdraw, and a few were just stopping by to ask questions or pay bills. The atmosphere inside the bank was a mix of hurried footsteps, quiet conversations, and the constant beeping of computers and ATMs. The walls were painted in neutral colors, the lights were bright, and everything looked perfectly ordinary, just another day in the life of a busy bank. Among the customers was a young black teenager, about 16 years old. He walked in casually, carrying a small backpack over one shoulder, looking around as he approached the counter. His clothes were simple, just a hoodie and jeans, but neat and clean. He seemed calm, polite, and completely unaware that his visit would soon turn into something that would change his day, and the lives of everyone present, forever. He had come to the bank for a simple reason, to deposit some money he had saved from his part-time job. Nothing about his visit was unusual, nothing about him suggested trouble. He smiled politely at the security guard as he walked past and headed toward the counter, holding his deposit slip tightly in his hand. However, not everyone in the bank saw him as ordinary. The bank manager, a woman in her 40s, was sitting behind her desk, reviewing some paperwork. She was used to dealing with all sorts of customers, and she prided herself on keeping the bank orderly. But that day, when she noticed the teenager, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was his hoodie, maybe it was the way he walked, or maybe it was just a split-second misjudgment, but she immediately felt uneasy. In her mind, a story started forming that had nothing to do with reality. She began watching him closely, paying attention to every move, every glance, every small gesture. The teenager, meanwhile, continued with his business, completely oblivious to the scrutiny. He approached the counter, greeted the teller politely, and handed over his deposit slip along with a few bills and coins. The teller smiled, took the money, and began the usual process. But the bank manager was still watching, her unease growing with each passing second. Her heart rate increased slightly, and she felt a sense of worry that she couldn't shake off. In her mind, the ordinary actions of the teenager started to seem suspicious, as if he might be hiding something or planning something wrong. Other customers in the bank were also present, but they were too busy with their own transactions to notice the tension building quietly at the counter. Some were talking softly to tellers, some were checking their phones, and a few glanced around the room, noticing the usual routine. Everything seemed normal to them. The young teenager, smiling politely, had no idea that the situation was about to take a dramatic turn. To him, it was just a simple visit to deposit money, a routine task he had done many times before. The air in the bank, however, was about to change. The manager's unease was growing, and it was the kind of unease that could turn an ordinary day into something unexpected. She kept glancing at the teenager, her mind racing with assumptions and possibilities that were entirely her own. Meanwhile, the teenager remained polite and calm, interacting with the teller without any hint of nervousness. It was a scene that, on the surface, seemed normal, but underneath, tension was quietly building like a storm ready to break. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The young teen was just a normal boy, and he had no reason to suspect that his day at the bank would suddenly become the center of attention for everyone in the room. He thought of the money he was depositing, the chores he had to finish afterward, and maybe what he would do with a friend later in the day. He was completely focused on his small, simple goal. Yet, in that quiet, ordinary moment, a series of events was about to unfold that would shock him, the bank staff, and eventually the world. It all began with a simple visit, a calm walk into a busy bank, and the ordinary action of a teen depositing his money. But ordinary days often hide extraordinary events, and this day was no exception. The stage was set for a story that would quickly escalate, exposing biases, misunderstandings, and the unexpected twists of life. The teenager had no idea, but this routine day would soon become a moment that everyone present would remember for years, a story that would be shared widely, debated, and talked about long after the last customer left the bank that morning. The young teenager had just handed over his deposit slip, and everything seemed normal at the bank. The teller began counting the money carefully, placing each bill and coin in the designated tray, while the teenager waited politely, glancing around the room. To anyone else, it would have looked like an ordinary, uneventful transaction, a routine part of everyday life. But for the bank manager, the moment was far from ordinary. As the teen stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a subtle, uneasy sensation, like a whisper at the back of her mind. She didn't know why she felt this way, and yet she felt compelled to act. Her eyes followed every move he made, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to another, the slight nervousness in his smile, the careful way he placed the money on the counter. Each small gesture, completely innocent on its own, began to build a story in her mind, a story that had no real foundation. The manager's thoughts raced. She wondered if he might be planning to steal, or maybe he had some other hidden motive. She imagined worst-case scenarios, each one more dramatic than the last. Her imagination, fueled by years of handling difficult situations in the bank, started painting the teenager in a suspicious light. In that moment, she convinced herself that caution was necessary, even though there was no real reason to suspect him. Other staff members noticed her glances, though they didn't immediately understand why she seemed so tense. The security guard, standing near the entrance, caught her eye a few times as if checking in silently. He had no idea what was running through the manager's mind, but he noticed her frown and the rigid way she sat in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. Meanwhile, the teenager continued to stand calmly, unaware of the scrutiny. He counted the seconds in his head, mentally preparing to finish the deposit and leave. He had come to the bank with no thought of causing trouble, and he certainly had no reason to feel nervous. He had been to this bank before, even alone, and nothing unusual had ever happened. Yet now, without warning, he found himself the focus of someone's suspicion, a suspicion that was completely unfounded. The manager leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes as she studied him. Each innocent movement, the way he scratched the back of his neck, the way he adjusted the strap of his backpack, was interpreted as a signal that something was wrong. Her mind was convinced that she was seeing signs that no one else could see. The ordinary actions of a teenager doing something completely normal suddenly seemed threatening to her. Even the other customers began to notice her unusual attention on the teenager. Some glanced in his direction, curious about why he was being watched so closely. A few whispered quietly among themselves, sensing the tension building in the air. The atmosphere in the bank, which had seemed calm just moments ago, started to feel charged, like static electricity before a storm. The normal, everyday hum of activity was now accompanied by a sense of anticipation, as if everyone present was waiting for something to happen. The teen, still polite and composed, felt a slight shift in the energy around him. He didn't understand it fully, but he could sense that something wasn't right. The eyes on him, the sudden quiet murmurs, and the sharp looks from the manager made him pause. He tried to focus on the teller, who was still processing his deposit, hoping that the situation would remain as ordinary as he had intended. But the manager's suspicion continued to grow. Her thoughts spiraled, becoming more urgent and more severe with every passing second. She started considering calling security, or even the police, believing that action was necessary to prevent something terrible from happening. The idea seemed extreme, but in her mind, it was justified. She felt a mix of fear, authority, and a responsibility to protect the bank, even though the reality was that there was no danger at all. What had started as a calm morning at the bank was now teetering on the edge of chaos. The teenager, unaware of the storm brewing around him, continued his simple task, hoping to complete his deposit quickly and leave. The teller, busy counting the money, noticed the manager's increasing tension but didn't know how to react. The other customers sensed that something unusual was happening, though none of them could predict the drama that was about to unfold. In that quiet, tense moment, the seed of suspicion had fully taken root. What began as a fleeting thought, a tiny spark of doubt, had now grown into a dangerous assumption. The teenager, simply doing what any young person might do in a bank, was about to face the consequences of a misunderstanding fueled by fear, bias, and imagination. And no one in that room could have guessed how the situation would escalate, or how quickly it would take a turn that no one expected. The tension that had quietly been building in the bank for several minutes reached a tipping point. The manager's eyes never left the teenager, her unease now transforming into a firm conviction that something must be done. She felt a strange mix of fear, authority, and responsibility. In her mind, the situation had escalated from a normal bank visit to a potential threat that required immediate action. Slowly, she reached for her phone on the desk. Her fingers trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of professionalism. She told herself that she was acting in the bank's best interest, protecting not only the money inside but also the people around her. The act of picking up the phone felt both necessary and terrifying. It was the moment when ordinary suspicion became an official action. The teenager, still unaware of the storm building around him, continued standing politely at the counter. He smiled softly at the teller, who was busy counting the bills, completely unaware that a decision was being made that could drastically change the course of the day. The other customers began to sense a shift in energy. A few turned their heads, noticing the manager speaking quietly into the phone. Whispers began to ripple through the room. Something serious was about to happen, though no one could yet tell exactly what. Through the manager's eyes, the act of summoning the police was entirely justified. Each innocent gesture by the teenager, a glance around the room, a small shuffle of his feet, a casual adjustment of his backpack strap, was interpreted as proof that something might be wrong. Her mind replayed scenarios where bank robberies or fraud could happen in a matter of seconds. She imagined the worst, each scenario more frightening than the last. And in that mental space, calling the authorities wasn't just precaution, it was urgent, necessary, unavoidable. The call itself was brief, formal, and professional. She spoke in a calm voice, carefully choosing her words to convey seriousness without admitting uncertainty. She described a suspicious individual, someone who seemed out of place and possibly a threat. As she spoke, her pulse raced, and the teen remained oblivious, still focused on completing his simple transaction. The teller glanced up occasionally, sensing something was wrong but not understanding the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, the first signs of escalation appeared. The security guard near the entrance straightened his posture, ears perked, and began observing the teenager more closely. The other bank staff members exchanged nervous glances, whispering questions to each other. Why would the manager call the police over a regular customer? The tension in the room became palpable, heavy enough that it almost seemed to press down on everyone present. Customers, who had come for routine banking, now found themselves trapped in a moment charged with uncertainty and anxiety. Meanwhile, the teenager's unease began to surface, though he couldn't quite explain it. Something in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The whispers, the stares, the sudden attention, he felt it all but couldn't understand why. His mind raced through possibilities. Did I do something wrong? Did I make a mistake with the deposit? But none of these questions prepared him for the reality that would soon confront him. As the seconds ticked by, the manager's decision seemed to validate itself in her mind. Each moment she spent watching the teenager reinforced her belief that she was acting correctly. Yet, at the same time, an invisible line had been crossed. A simple, harmless visit to the bank was no longer ordinary, it had become a confrontation waiting to happen. Then came the sound everyone had been anticipating, the unmistakable arrival of police officers outside the bank doors. Their footsteps echoed in the lobby, announcing their presence even before they entered. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The teen froze, confusion and fear flashing across his face. Customers whispered in disbelief, some reaching for their phones to record what was happening. The manager straightened, a mix of authority and relief in her posture. In her mind, the situation was under control, she had acted decisively, taking responsibility for what she perceived as a potential threat. Yet, in the back of the room, the first hint of something unexpected began to emerge. While the manager saw only danger, the reality of the moment was far different. The teenager had no intention of causing trouble, he had not broken any law, committed no crime, and was completely unaware that his simple visit had spiraled into this. And as the police stepped through the doors, the room held its breath, waiting to see what would unfold next. This was the turning point, the moment when a routine day at the bank became a story that would soon go viral. A teenager, simply depositing his hard-earned money, now faced the consequences of someone else's fear and assumptions. The ordinary had collided with the extraordinary, and everyone in the bank, whether staff or customer, was about to witness a confrontation that no one would ever forget. The moment the police entered the bank, the atmosphere shifted instantly. What had started as a simple, routine day had now become something almost cinematic, a scene charged with tension that everyone in the room could feel. The officers, calm but alert, scanned the room with professional eyes. Their presence alone seemed to magnify the sense of unease, turning an ordinary lobby into a stage for a situation that none of the witnesses could have imagined. The teenager froze, a mixture of confusion, fear, and disbelief washing over him. He had never been in trouble before, never faced the attention of law enforcement, and certainly never imagined that his everyday visit to a bank would end like this. His hands trembled slightly, gripping the edge of the counter as his mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Customers, once quietly going about their transactions, now whispered frantically, phones in hand, capturing every second of what seemed like an unfolding drama. The teller behind the counter looked up nervously, her hands paused mid-task. She had no idea how to defuse the situation. The bills sat neatly in trays, untouched, while the bank manager's gaze remained fixed on the teenager, her posture rigid with authority. She had acted decisively, summoning the police, and now she watched, convinced that she had prevented a potential threat. But what she didn't realize was how quickly the situation had begun spiraling out of control, fueled not by the teenager's actions but by assumptions and fear. The security guard stepped closer to the teenager, trying to maintain a professional demeanor but clearly tense. His eyes flicked between the officers and the young boy, uncertain whether to intervene or wait. Every subtle movement the teen made, the way he shifted his weight, the way he glanced nervously at the approaching officers, was interpreted through the lens of suspicion. What was innocent in reality was now magnified into something that appeared dangerous, and the ordinary energy of the bank had been replaced with charged anticipation. Other customers reacted in different ways. Some froze, unsure whether to get involved, while others whispered quietly to each other, sharing their disbelief. A few braver individuals subtly raised their phones, recording the encounter, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary. It was one of those rare moments when a mundane setting, rows of counters, piles of forms, and humming computers, transformed into a stage for a story that would shock anyone who heard about it later. The teenager, meanwhile, tried to speak, to explain that he was just depositing money, that there was no problem, that he had done nothing wrong. But the presence of the officers, their measured and alert demeanor, made him hesitate. Fear had a way of silencing him, of turning simple words into stammers that didn't make sense in the charged air of the moment. His voice, calm in ordinary circumstances, now seemed small and uncertain against the weight of authority and assumption pressing down on him. As the officers approached, the manager whispered instructions to them, describing the suspicious individual, with a confidence born of conviction rather than fact. The teenager's innocence was invisible in the eyes of authority. All that mattered to the observers was the narrative that had been constructed in the manager's mind. Each step the officers took toward him increased his anxiety, each glance their way a reminder that he had been misjudged, misinterpreted, and unfairly targeted. Time seemed to slow in the bank. What should have been minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The other customers, still frozen or recording on their phones, watched the unfolding drama with a mix of shock and disbelief. Some couldn't look away, drawn to the intensity of the moment. Others quietly muttered about fairness and bias, feeling the tension in the room like a tangible thing. The air, once ordinary and routine, now seemed thick, heavy with anticipation and unspoken questions. The teenager's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that a simple trip to deposit his money had become a life-changing moment. Fear, confusion, and frustration swirled inside him. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the intensity of the situation made even the simplest words feel inadequate. The officers, trained to respond to perceived threats, moved cautiously but deliberately, their attention fully on him. The escalation had reached its peak, and everyone in the room understood, silently, that what happened next could define the rest of the day, and perhaps far more. And then, in that tense silence, the first hints of an unexpected twist began to form, a twist so unpredictable, so extraordinary, that no one, not the manager, not the officers, not the customers, could have imagined it. The teenager, still trembling, waited, the air thick with tension and expectation, not knowing that the next moment would change everything and reveal a truth more shocking than anyone could have predicted. Just as the tension in the bank reached its peak, a figure appeared at the entrance. The crowd, the officers, and even the bank manager all turned instinctively to see who it was. Everyone expected another layer of authority, perhaps a supervisor or more police. But what walked into the room was someone entirely unexpected, someone whose presence would instantly change everything. It was the CEO of the bank. The room seemed to pause for a heartbeat as she entered. Her presence was commanding but calm, radiating a confidence that instantly altered the energy in the room. Unlike the manager, who had been tense and anxious, the CEO exuded control and clarity. She wore a simple business suit, her hair neatly pulled back, and her expression was composed yet alert. Everyone could feel that she was someone who could handle any situation, no matter how tense or chaotic. The bank manager, still tense and standing rigidly by the counter, felt a mix of relief and pride. In her mind, the CEO's arrival validated her actions. The police, too, straightened, ready to report what they had been called for. And the teenager, caught in the middle of all this, could only look up in confusion, unsure what was about to happen next. Then, the impossible happened. The CEO's gaze fell directly on the teenager, and the entire room seemed to shift. The intensity of her look was not one of suspicion or authority, it was recognition. Her eyes softened, her posture relaxed slightly, and an unmistakable warmth spread across her face. She stepped forward, her voice calm but full of authority, addressing the tension in the room. "This is my son," she said simply. The words cut through the tension like sunlight piercing through clouds. Silence fell immediately. Customers froze, officers paused mid-step, and even the manager felt the world tilt slightly under the weight of this revelation. The young teenager's eyes widened in shock. His confusion transformed into a mix of relief, disbelief, and an overwhelming rush of emotion. The officers stopped in their tracks, unsure how to respond. The manager, who had been so certain that she was acting correctly, now felt a sudden, heavy weight of realization. She had misjudged the situation entirely. Her assumptions, her fear, and her snap judgment had led to an escalation that was entirely unnecessary. The room, which had been thick with tension moments ago, now seemed almost surreal in the quiet that followed. The CEO approached her son and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Her voice, warm and reassuring, broke through the lingering tension. "Everything is okay," she said. The teenager exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of relief that washed over him like a tidal wave. The officers nodded politely, understanding the mistake but unsure how to process the sudden turn of events. Meanwhile, the bank manager's mind raced. She had acted with what she believed was caution, yet her assumptions had almost caused harm. The realization hit her hard, a mix of shame, embarrassment, and introspection. Around the room, customers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others marveling at the extraordinary twist that had just occurred. Phones clicked, capturing the moment that would soon go viral, a story that defied expectation and challenged everyone's assumptions. The teenager, still processing the revelation, looked at his mother, his CEO mother, and felt a surge of mixed emotions, relief, admiration, and perhaps a touch of anger for how the situation had unfolded. But mostly, he felt grateful that the tension had ended without harm and that the truth had finally been revealed. The unexpected twist had not only saved him from a disastrous misunderstanding but had also turned the entire day into a life lesson for everyone present. This moment, the sudden unveiling of a shocking truth, transformed the bank from a place of routine into a scene of unforgettable drama. What could have been a frightening encounter ended with relief, recognition, and an extraordinary story that would soon captivate anyone who heard it. The ordinary had collided with the extraordinary, and the consequences of fear, assumption, and bias were laid bare for all to see. In that single moment, the entire bank learned a lesson that no policy manual could teach: appearances can be deceiving, assumptions can be dangerous, and truth has a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected ways. The room, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter, charged instead with awe, disbelief, and a renewed sense of humanity. The unexpected twist wasn't just a revelation, it was a turning point, a moment that would be remembered long after the doors of the bank closed that day. The moment the CEO revealed that the teenager was her son, the room seemed to change instantly. What had been tension, fear, and suspicion transformed into silence, awe, and disbelief. Customers, who had been watching the scene unfold, now looked on with wide eyes, some whispering to each other, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The police officers, trained to respond to potential threats, now found themselves in a situation far beyond routine procedures. Even the bank manager, who had been so certain that she was acting in the bank's best interest, froze, her mind racing with the sudden, overwhelming reality of what had just happened. The teenager, still standing at the counter, felt a whirlwind of emotions crash over him. Relief washed over him first, an almost physical sensation that made his shoulders drop and his chest loosen. But it was quickly followed by shock, disbelief, and even anger, not at his mother, but at the sequence of events that had brought him to this moment. The fear, humiliation, and confusion he had felt in the past few minutes now collided with the relief of knowing that the truth had been revealed. Around the room, whispers grew into murmurs as people tried to make sense of what they had just seen. "Her son," someone whispered under their breath, shaking their head. Another customer murmured, "I can't believe this, all that tension for nothing." Phones that had been recording the incident continued to click, capturing every expression, every pause, every subtle detail of the revelation. The story was already becoming something extraordinary, something people would share and talk about long after that day. The CEO, calm and composed, approached her son and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her presence, warm and reassuring, seemed to calm not only him but everyone else in the room. "It's okay now," she said softly, her voice carrying authority, love, and compassion all at once. The teenager nodded slowly, processing both the relief and the reality that he had narrowly avoided a situation that could have escalated unnecessarily. The bank manager, standing stiffly behind the counter, felt a flood of emotions she hadn't anticipated. Shock, embarrassment, and guilt collided inside her as she realized the weight of her assumptions. Every thought she had convinced herself was justified, the fear, the suspicion, the decision to call the police, now seemed almost surreal in the light of the truth. She looked at the teenager, now relaxed but still visibly shaken, and felt a deep sense of responsibility for how her actions had contributed to the escalation. The officers, ever professional, adjusted their demeanor to match the new reality. Their expressions softened, and they began to step back, acknowledging that the perceived threat had been entirely a misunderstanding. Yet, they remained composed, aware that the situation, though resolved, had revealed something important, that assumptions, even when well-intentioned, could escalate situations in unexpected ways. As the room began to settle, a reflective mood took hold. Customers, staff, and even the officers began to process what they had seen. This was more than just a shocking moment. It was a lesson about perception, bias, and the dangers of jumping to conclusions. The revelation had laid bare the power of assumptions and how easily fear can distort reality, even in a setting as ordinary as a bank. The teenager, now fully aware of the situation's gravity, felt gratitude toward his mother for stepping in at precisely the right moment. At the same time, he couldn't help but reflect on the experience, how quickly a normal day could turn into a moment of fear and humiliation based on nothing more than perception. It was a life lesson, unforgettable in its intensity and its clarity, one that would stay with him forever. The CEO, noticing the tension still lingering among the staff and customers, spoke gently but firmly. "We all have a responsibility to look beyond appearances," she said. Her words, simple but powerful, resonated throughout the room. Everyone present understood that what had unfolded was more than a personal story, it was a mirror reflecting larger truths about society, bias, and human behavior. In that moment, the bank became more than a workplace or a place for transactions. It became a classroom, a stage, and a witness to an extraordinary lesson about judgment, awareness, and empathy. The revelation had transformed fear into understanding, suspicion into reflection, and chaos into a story that would be remembered long after the day ended. The aftermath of the revelation left a quiet but powerful energy in the bank. What had begun as a normal morning had transformed into a moment none of the witnesses would ever forget. Customers, staff, and even the officers found themselves reflecting deeply on what had just occurred, and the lessons embedded in those few tense minutes. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a collective pause, as if everyone in the room needed time to process the collision of fear, assumption, and truth. The bank manager, still standing near the counter, felt a storm of emotions swirl inside her. Embarrassment and guilt weighed heavily, but they were accompanied by a dawning realization. She recognized how quickly her assumptions had escalated a completely harmless situation. In an instant, she had turned a routine deposit into a near crisis. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the profound responsibility that comes with authority, not just to act decisively, but to act wisely, without letting fear cloud judgment. The officers, too, reflected on the incident. Though their role was to respond to perceived threats, they understood that even trained professionals could be drawn into misinterpretations when assumptions overpowered facts. They silently acknowledged the delicate balance between caution and overreaction, realizing that sometimes the difference between safety and harm lies not in authority, but in awareness and understanding. The teenager, standing beside his mother, felt the weight of the moment settle upon him. Relief was the first emotion, a surge of freedom from the tension that had gripped him. But as he looked around at the faces of those who had watched him, some with sympathy, some with shock, he realized that this day had given him a lesson in humanity. The event had exposed prejudice, fear, and assumptions, but it had also revealed courage, authority used wisely, and the power of love. Even the customers, who had only come to the bank to conduct their ordinary business, found themselves in deep reflection. Some whispered to each other about the fragility of judgment, others pondered the biases that might influence their own decisions in life. A few who had recorded the events on their phones paused the playback, their faces thoughtful as they considered what they had just witnessed. What started as a viral-worthy scene had transformed into a quiet, universal lesson for everyone present. The CEO, observing the mix of emotions, decided to address the room. Her voice, calm but resonant, carried a message that cut through lingering tension. She spoke about awareness, respect, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not just the impressions we form at first glance. Her words weren't just a reprimand or a lecture, they were a reflection, an invitation for everyone to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. The bank, once a place of ordinary transactions, had become a classroom for empathy, judgment, and accountability. As the day continued, the atmosphere gradually shifted from unease to contemplation. The story of what had occurred would soon spread beyond the walls of the bank, shared on social media, discussed among friends, and debated in countless conversations. But inside the bank, in that quiet space, the lesson was immediate and personal. Every person who had witnessed the event left with a new understanding of how assumptions can escalate situations and how empathy, awareness, and truth can restore balance. The reflection extended even beyond the immediate participants. For the teenager, it became a lesson in resilience, a moment of understanding how the world sometimes misjudges people and how courage and composure can carry someone through even the most unfair situations. For the manager, it became a lesson in humility, an opportunity to examine biases and learn from them. And for the CEO, it was a reminder of the responsibilities that come with leadership, not just to manage operations, but to safeguard humanity in every interaction. In the end, the reflection of that day was more profound than any initial shock or fear. The bank, the people, and the young teenager had all been part of a story that revealed universal truths about perception, judgment, and the consequences of assumptions. It was a story that reminded everyone that real-life lessons often come unexpectedly, that every ordinary moment carries the potential for extraordinary insight, and that awareness and empathy are the greatest tools we have to navigate a complex world. The quiet in the bank now felt lighter, filled with thoughtfulness rather than tension. Every person, in their own way, carried the reflection forward, a lesson in human behavior that could not be ignored, a moment of awareness that would linger long after the doors closed that day. The tension in the bank finally gave way to a sense of calm, though the calm was far from ordinary. The extraordinary events of the morning had left their mark on everyone present, customers, staff, officers, and most importantly, the young teenager who had become the center of the story. What began as a simple, everyday visit to deposit money had evolved into a lesson that none of them would ever forget. The resolution wasn't just about ending the confrontation, it was about understanding, learning, and ensuring that something meaningful would emerge from a moment of fear and misunderstanding. The CEO, having taken control of the situation with both authority and compassion, began guiding the bank staff and customers toward a sense of closure. She spoke to the room with a calm, steady voice, reminding everyone that assumptions can be dangerous, but that reflection, empathy, and awareness have the power to restore balance. Her words resonated, and the staff listened attentively, realizing that the morning's events had been a wake-up call for them all. The manager, who had called the police in fear, now stood quietly, absorbing the lesson and reflecting on her own behavior. She understood, more deeply than ever, how important it was to check one's assumptions and approach situations with fairness and understanding before acting. The teenager, standing beside his mother, felt a profound sense of relief, safety, and even pride. Relief that the situation had been resolved without harm, safety in the presence of his mother, and pride in maintaining composure throughout an ordeal that would have shaken anyone. Though the humiliation and fear of those moments could not be erased entirely, they became part of a larger story, one that would teach him resilience, patience, and the value of staying calm in the face of unfair judgment. The young boy realized that even in moments of misunderstanding and danger, truth and compassion have the power to bring resolution and clarity. The customers who had witnessed the unfolding drama also began to react differently. What had been shock and curiosity now shifted into reflection and conversation. Many discussed the event in hushed tones, marveling at the unexpected twist and the lessons it carried about human behavior. A few of them, who had recorded parts of the incident, considered sharing it online, not to shame, but to spread awareness about the dangers of assumptions and bias. Everyone present understood that this was more than a story, it was a mirror of society, a reminder of how easily fear can escalate situations and how awareness and empathy can restore balance. Even the officers, who had initially arrived with caution and authority, were left reflecting on their role in the unfolding drama. They realized that while their duty was to protect, it was equally important to remain observant and open-minded. The incident reminded them that training, procedure, and protocol are essential, but so too are patience, empathy, and a willingness to consider all possibilities before acting. In the minutes that followed, the bank resumed a semblance of normalcy. Transactions continued, phones stopped recording, and the ordinary rhythm of the day returned. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed permanently. Everyone present carried with them the memory of an incident that had begun with fear and assumptions and ended with revelation, learning, and understanding. The young teenager, his mother, and the staff all emerged with a deeper appreciation of human behavior, the power of truth, and the importance of fairness in every interaction. The resolution was not just about ending the confrontation, it was about transformation. The bank had become more than a workplace, it had become a classroom for empathy, judgment, and accountability. The manager learned humility and awareness. The officers gained a renewed perspective on vigilance and compassion. Customers witnessed firsthand how quickly assumptions can escalate and how resolution requires honesty, truth, and understanding. And the teenager, whose ordinary day had been turned upside down, carried forward the most powerful lesson of all, that dignity, patience, and composure in the face of misunderstanding can transform fear into learning. By the time the doors closed, the bank was quiet once again. Yet the echoes of the day lingered in the hearts and minds of everyone present. The extraordinary incident had left a lasting impression, a story that would be retold, reflected upon, and shared, not as a tale of fear, but as a story of awareness, empathy, and the incredible power of truth. The resolution was complete, but its impact would resonate far beyond the walls of the bank, serving as a powerful reminder that ordinary days can hold extraordinary lessons, and that human understanding is the key to navigating life's most unexpected moments.